Good Yantif. This is going to be a test of your willpower. I'm over here for a moment because just temporarily I don't want you to look at that side of the bima. Stick with me over here. When I say the word menorah, how many candles does it have? Heard a little rustling over there. I heard some eights, which makes sense. We think of the 8 nights of Hanukkah. I think I heard a few people say 9. Remember the shamus, right? But right here in front, I heard, if we look over here now at our menorah, how many candles? 7. Why does our menorah have 7 candles? Although menorah is a general term for a candelabra, including the special one we use on Hanukkah, the ones you see in any sanctuary represent the original menorah from the tabernacle and Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Judaism has always marked the passage of time primarily by weeks, not years. A complete week is our symbol of completeness and perfection. And the menorah reminds us that God created the entire world in 7 days. 7 days in which we work and create and forge, take some time for ourselves and our families, and then a new week full of possibility unfolds. But if we understand both our creation story and the bold innovation of Shabbat as concepts that were crafted by human experience, tapping into divine inspiration and providing us with pragmatic wisdom, how did 7s become our framework in the first place? Why wasn't a week 4 days or 9? It turns out there are lots of interesting facts when it comes to the number 7. Think perhaps of the 7 dwarfs, the 7 seas, the 7 wonders of the world. But more than that, 7s appear to reflect a deep truth written directly into nature's code. For some of you, if you got here early this evening when you walked in, did anybody see the rainbow above the sanctuary? There was a beautiful rainbow tonight, and if you recall, a rainbow has 7 distinct bands of color. Remember Roy G. Biv? Strangely, you can only fold a standard piece of paper 7 times. Go ahead, try it at home, only 7 times. And over the summer, we had a guest scholar one week named Elizabeth Yari from Hazon, who explained that the veins in any plant or tree leaves can only bifurcate a maximum of 7 times. It seems that 7 represents some sort of natural limit, a boundary beyond which some things either cannot go or must start again. 7, therefore, is the number of completeness, and as I said, in the Jewish sense, perfection. Over the past few years at these high holidays, you've heard me describe my deep love for and affection and fascination with Israel. I've shared my hopes for Israel's future, my frustration with Israel's blemishes, and my passion for spending time in Israel. But Israel is complicated, and it can be hard to understand how the modern story of Israel unfolded, much less be prepared to defend Israel's honor when others attack it. I realized a number of years ago that the number 7 also connects to Israel. I believe you can understand everything you need to know about what is known as the matzav, or the situation, by exploring the events of 1897, 1917, 1947, 1967, and 1987. All those 7s feel like more than a coincidence to me. And perhaps this evening we might eventually discover that Israel is more than just a Jewish ideal, but yet another Jewish path toward perfection. We begin with 1897. Europe had been a brutal place for Jews going back more than 1,000 years. There were crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries, followed by expulsions from England in 1290, France in 1306, Poland and Italy in 1483, and complete expulsion from Spain and Portugal in 1492. We suffered through blood libels, massacres, book burnings, ghettos, pogroms, and a general sense that Jews were not welcome in Europe. So the trial of Alfred Dreyfus in 1894, a captain in the French army unjustly accused of treason simply because he was Jewish, might pale in comparison to all that. One more Jew sent to Devil's Island wouldn't merit a footnote in our history of persecution. except that this trial was witnessed by a young Austrian journalist named Theodor Herzl. Herzl was distressed, of course, to see such blatant anti-Semitism in Europe's intellectual and cultural capital. Nothing new. What made him different was that he quickly concluded that things would never truly change for the Jews of Europe, and that anti-Semitism could never be defeated, only avoided. A Jewish state was the only solution. In 3 short years, Herzl turned centuries of Jewish yearning into a real movement with practical goals and structure. He convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897 and is widely given credit for creating modern Zionism. That meeting was the first time in millennia that Jews began to take destiny into our own hands again. To many, his solution sounded like utopian thinking. How could we build a state in Argentina or Uganda or even perhaps in our ancient homeland when human history had passed us by, the nations of the world were not supportive, and even our own people were mostly uninterested? Herzl's genius was not in the idea. Others discussed it for centuries, but in his categorical unwillingness to sit back and wait for the Messiah. He didn't simply revive our ancient quest for a homeland. He infused Jews around the world with the spirit of confidence that even the most daunting tasks are achievable. Looking back from where we sit, it would be hard to imagine how crazy the idea was. But for Herzl, none of that mattered. He had faith. And he entrusted us with a stirring expression that sums up his courageous approach.
Im tirzu, in so agada, liot am chofshi be'artzenu, be'eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim.
Herzl's words, "If you will it, it is no longer just a dream." Jewish perfection means believing with Herzl that we can achieve anything by relying on our highest ideals and the strongest efforts of the most passionate people. In 1897, Theodor Herzl proved to be somewhat prophetic, believing the impossible, striving for things that felt too big, and taking bold steps toward eternal ambitions. 1917. Even though the dream of Israel began as a response to hatred and persecution, the truth is that was just our issue. Alone, we were never going to get anywhere. 100 years ago, the sun never set on the British Empire, and after World War I, the world's greatest power controlled the fate of what was then called Palestine. That name, by the way, is a Roman reference to our old biblical enemies, the Philistines. You may remember them. A people who faded away long ago. So the name Philistia, or eventually Palestine, was a jab at our lack of power even to control the name of our own land. Aside from the clash of European powers, World War I provided a swift end for the Ottoman Empire, one of the world's great civilizations. Jews had actually been treated fairly well by the Sultan, and while Jews always lived in the Holy Land, our population under their rule had grown significantly. But World War provided a unique opportunity as the maps were all being redrawn. Part of what the Zionists accomplished since 1897 was building strong relationships with governments across Europe. So we were prepared on November 2nd, 1917, when Zionist leaders in London received an extraordinary gift, the Balfour Declaration. Britain's foreign minister declared that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Prior to 1917, the quest for Israel was our own tortured journey. Suddenly, the biggest kid on the playground was on our side. And that made all the difference. Hope is an interesting word. It comes across sounding passive to just hope that something positive will happen. But the Jewish conception of hope is not passive. We work at it. We build it. We are empowered. So it was not providence. It was not simply God's will that Hatikva, or the hope, came to be utilized as our Zionist anthem.
Od loved Atikvateinu, Atikva bochnot alpayim, lichyotam chopshi be'atzenu, Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim.
Our hope is not yet lost. The hope of 2,000 years. Hope is a Jewish value. Finding that sweet spot between fantasy and pragmatism, where we are encouraged enough to work hard while chastened enough to stay vigilant. Only by working together with true partners can we maintain our hope for better days. And 100 years ago, that act of hope was rewarded with the first international step toward Israel's statehood. 1947. We know that the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948, but the crucial moment actually happened the previous year. In 1947, the world was still coming to grips with the Holocaust. It was an affront to humanity, and the nations of the world didn't quite know how to respond. At the same time, Britain's promise of 1917 had gotten mired in realpolitik. On the ground, Arab revolts made moving forward nearly impossible. And after being battered terribly in World War II, Britain was seeking an exit from the nation-building business. So they introduced a plan for partition to the fledgling United Nations with the intention of creating a win-win situation for both Arabs and Jews. The Arabs at that time already lived in dozens of countries across the Middle East and North Africa. This partition would have created one more on 87% of the territory Britain had set aside originally for a Jewish state, alongside Israel, sitting on land that was not contiguous and was composed mostly of the Negev desert. Jewish leaders eagerly accepted this compromise, while the Arab world famously said no. Nonetheless, Britain pushed forward, and 70 years ago, on November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved Resolution 181. Like 1917, this was a stunning development for Jews around the globe who had long been persecuted or ignored. The world had spoken, perhaps not quite in favor of Jews, but a balanced resolution that certainly was inclusive of Jews for the first time. In that moment, the narrative splits. Looking back from today, we may recognize that there are two sides to every story. And I know that some are particularly interested in hearing the other side, hearkening to the other side as a value. But I would beg your willingness to put that aside for another day. It is an important, vital conversation that we will have here at Temple. But tonight is about the trailblazing nature of our particular story. And when that incredible vote happened in 1947 among the nations of the world, Israel literally rose from the ashes of the Holocaust. I would never suggest that the victims of the Holocaust died for a purpose. It was the definition of evil in human history. Nonetheless, we should not forget that Israel rose in part because they fell. Without the Holocaust, it is unclear the UN ever would have given its imprimatur to a plan like this. In the face of utter destruction, it would have been easy for us to give up the dream entirely, but we didn't. And the spirit that kept us moving forward was captured by a young Hungarian woman named Hannah Senes. She moved to Israel at the age of 19, joined the paramilitary Haganah a few years later, and with war raging all around her, she enlisted with the British Army as a specialist and parachuted into occupied Europe to help save and rescue other Jews. Sadly, she was captured and eventually killed during the war. But even in captivity, she composed poems, including a verse that captures the tragic magnificence of her life.
Eli, Eli, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
Israel was created against a backdrop of hope and pain, courage and suffering, resilience and fear. Hannah Senesh quietly demands that we see, pray for, and work toward hope in the face of great evil. And in today's world, we must continue to do so. 1967. The Jewish world changed dramatically in the summer of 1967. It had been almost 20 years since Israel was formed, but joy had given way to weariness as her neighbors waged war on Israel from the day after its declaration. On June 1st of that year, Jews around the world could easily have despaired that Israel would survive the week, let alone be any sort of lasting presence in their lives. Mighty Egypt had been rattling sabers, closing the Straits of Tiran and massing troops on Israel's border. Gamal Abdul Nasser kicked out UN buffer forces and declared very publicly their intention to come in and wipe out, destroy, and wipe our nation from the face of the globe. On June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, effectively winning the war in its beginning moments. It was only a formality that it lasted 6 days, and Israel suddenly was recognized not just as a tiny nation in a sea of Arab states, but as a military force to be reckoned with. Jews around the world swelled with pride. This had not been part of our collective consciousness for more than 2,000 years, perhaps back as far as kings like David and Solomon. I don't mean, of course, to romanticize violence, but 50 years ago, we started looking in the mirror a little differently. The reunification of Jerusalem was most emotional of all. It was not boastful, it was not bloodthirsty, it was not demeaning. It reflected the inner spiritual beauty of an old, worn city that possessed infinite meaning. It expressed relief and soulful gratitude. Naomi Shemer gave voice to the uniquely Jewish feeling of victory with stunning clarity in a song that is considered by many to be not only the legacy par excellence of 1967, but perhaps the pinnacle of Jewish musical expression in modern times.
ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושלום עלו לחוש שירייך אני כינו ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושלום עלו לחוש שירייך אני כינו.
Even beyond the words, it's just a stunning song. You can hear the plaintive nature. This is not an angry or fearful song. Jerusalem of gold and of bronze and of light, I shall be a harp for all your melodies. After spending 2,000 years as a powerless entity at the mercy of lords and princes wherever we lived, Jews finally found a way to embody power in a Jewish manner. Much debate has ensued, certainly, But Jewish perfection must include wrestling with the functions of modern life and newfound authority in pursuit of something holy. 1987. I remember learning a new word 30 years ago, intifada. I was rapt as the images crossed my screen, and Jews watched in disbelief as this uprising pitted kids with rocks and slingshots against powerful Israeli soldiers and tanks. It didn't look like a fair fight, and that was the point. Our Palestinian neighbors somehow understood the information age better and sooner than tech-savvy Israel, and never has a group better exploited the concept of a picture is worth 1,000 words. By November of 1987, when the violence in the streets broke out, nobody thought Israel was going to be swept into the sea by Arab armies. But in the space of a few months, Israel went from being David fighting the Arab Goliath to being Goliath standing in the face of scrappy underdog Palestinians. It was glaringly effective and ushered in an era that has only continued to plague Israel. When I was studying all this in college, the situation was simply called the Arab-Israeli conflict. Suddenly, it became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The connotation is completely different, and we have not yet escaped that damning characterization. The past 3 decades have been incredibly destructive to Jewish standing around the world. We've seen a dramatic increase in anti-Semitism, casually at times linked to impressions of Israel, impressions that are simply often not true. Just one example is the infamous Jenin massacre, a massacre that never actually happened, but has been used since 2002 to condemn Israel. Did innocent people die in the town of Jenin as Israeli soldiers exposed themselves to danger by searching for terrorists door to door? Yes. Not a massacre, but 7 to 10 civilians. Does this mean Israel did something wrong? Not necessarily. The ethics of war and military power and police force are very complicated. Every enlightened nation wrestles with how to appropriately utilize power. America has our own issues in that regard. But while Israel tries to effectively answer these questions, the foremost campaign by Israel's enemies today is not physically to destroy Israel, although Hamas, Hezbollah, and others certainly would like to. Instead, the day-to-day program is to discredit and delegitimize Israel so that world opinion becomes toxic enough that we will be forced to accept untenable resolutions, or worse, that some world body will take action to dismantle Israel as a supposed threat to world peace and stability. I shouldn't even need to say out loud that Israel is unquestionably the most open, democratic, inclusive, progressive, and peace-oriented country in the Middle East. But since 1987, since the Intifada, the world has not viewed it that way. After all we learned from Herzl in 1897, Balfour in 1917, the UN vote in 1947, the Six-Day War in 1967, and given the way Israel has been portrayed in this era of media warfare since 1987, what is the truth about Israel? I said earlier that by exploring the various sevens that make up Israel's modern story, we might find a path to perfection. So here's the secret. Israel is not perfect. Israel makes mistakes like every other country in the world, and Jews, like all other people, are only human. The more important test of a person or a nation is how do we respond when difficulties arise. There is a well-known passage about Israel in the Talmud which describes Yerushalayim shel Mala and Yerushalayim shel Mata, the earthly Jerusalem and the heavenly Jerusalem. In other words, Jerusalem is more than a place, it is a symbol. And I believe that Israel's perfection can be found not in the actual place, which is wonderful and gritty and real, but in its allegorical nature. If you've ever wondered why Israel gets so much attention on the world stage, people, not just us, people take seriously the idea that Israel is supposed to be better, supposed to be more. Israel is supposed to be a place where we can find a path to that heavenly realm where all things are the way we wish them to be. And how do we access that place? Perhaps we find it in the humble story of Daphne and Yoel, two young Israelis who grew up imbued with the Jewish character of Israel, two aspiring musicians who joined together to create music for a spiritual community in Jerusalem called Nava Tehillah, beautiful songs of praise. Those two, their group is not an aberration. They could have come of age in Berkeley or Boston or Boulder, but it was Israel that gave life to their musical vision, just as Israel has given sacred purpose to so many. We sit here on Yom Kippur, embracing our own imperfections in order to better understand the ideal person we are each trying to become. As proud as we may be of the lives we have built, there is always room for growth. Israel, both the earthly and the heavenly, has the unique capacity to inspire us toward our own perfection. This year, perhaps Israel will inspire us to hope and dream, strive and celebrate, and do our best to live up to the ancient words that we say at every single service, and which Nava Tehillah has made into their most popular song. Oseh Shalom Bimromav. May the one who causes peace to reign in the high heavens let peace descend on us across all Israel and upon all humanity.
Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Uya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imru
May this be God's will.